In the year circa 750 BC, as the sun rose over the rugged, rich hills of Laconia, the Spartan elders gathered in the open square of the Gerousia. Their faces were carved with age, bearing the look of men who believed in only one truth: survival through strength. It was in this stark and unforgiving landscape that a society deliberately set itself apart from the rest of Greece. While other states celebrated art, trade, and intellectual debate, Sparta pursued something far more severe. It was during this early archaic period, as the Spartans consolidated power after the First Messenian War, that a disturbing and calculated social order emerged, one that treated human life as raw material for constructing the perfect warrior class. Sparta's rise was not accidental, nor was its cruelty random. The system future generations would remember with a mixture of horror and fascination grew from a single fear: the fear of being overwhelmed by the Helots, the enslaved population that outnumbered Spartans nearly 7-1. The Spartans understood that their survival depended on producing soldiers who were not just competent but physically superior, psychologically conditioned, and utterly devoted to the state. And to achieve such a society, they created a structure unlike anything the ancient world had seen. It was here, in these early decades of Spartan expansion, that the foundations of their breeding and social engineering policies began to take shape. According to several classical sources, especially Plutarch's later accounts, Sparta believed that the strength of the state began before birth. Their philosophy was ruthlessly simple: only strong children should live, and only strong men and women should reproduce. This was the opposite of typical Greek values, which placed family honor and continuity above the concerns of the state. Sparta reversed this entirely. The individual was meaningless compared to the survival of the collective. No child belonged fully to their parents, they belonged to Sparta. From the moment a Spartan baby was born, it was inspected by elders. These men were tasked with determining whether the child was physically flawless, sturdy, and capable of growing into a warrior or a strong mother of warriors. If the newborn showed signs of weakness, deformity, or frailty, it was taken to a mountainside near Mount Taygetus. Early sources disagree whether the infants were thrown into a ravine or simply left exposed, but the intent is clear. Sparta refused to nurture anyone deemed unfit. This stark practice, often exaggerated in later writings but grounded in genuine Spartan law, formed the first pillar of their brutal selection system. However, the inhumane breeding ideology extended far beyond the treatment of infants. Sparta understood that their warrior society required planned reproduction. This was not breeding in the animal sense, but it was undeniably a controlled system that dictated who could marry, when they could marry, and even with whom they could have children. Marriage was not primarily a romantic union. It was sponsored genetic engineering designed to produce the strongest possible future citizen. To the Spartans, love was irrelevant, but producing strong offspring was sacred. The state encouraged men to marry late, around age 30, after years of military conditioning. Women, conversely, were expected to marry in their late teens or early 20s at the peak of physical health. This combination, according to Spartan belief, created the healthiest children. A man who failed to marry or produce children was publicly shamed during festivals, mocked by younger warriors, and sometimes barred from watching athletic contests. This was not casual pressure, it was state-mandated reproduction. Even more unsettling was the practice that allowed older or weaker husbands to permit stronger men to father children with their wives. While shocking through a modern lens, the logic was again rooted in survival. The Spartans believed that superior offspring served the state, regardless of personal emotions or attachments. This was not an everyday occurrence, but was sufficiently common and widely accepted to be mentioned by multiple classical writers. It is one of the clearest examples of Spartan reproductive pragmatism. The goal was a perfect warrior class, even if it meant sacrificing familial exclusivity. Behind this breeding system stood the figure of Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver. Whether he was a real historical figure or a political myth strengthened over generations, his influence shaped the Spartan mindset. Lycurgus supposedly instituted these laws to transform Sparta into a super-state built entirely around military dominance. According to tradition, he believed the strength of the phalanx required not just discipline and training, but also a population genetically and physically superior. This narrative, whether fully accurate or partially mythic, reveals how deeply the Spartans internalized the idea that breeding and warfare were connected. Yet, the system was not merely about physical strength, it was also about psychological conditioning. Spartan boys who passed the newborn selection test would soon find themselves in the Agoge, the harsh state-run upbringing that erased individuality and built warriors through relentless discipline. But the Agoge depended on having boys already predisposed to toughness, and thus the breeding practices served as a preliminary filter. Women played a central role in this state ideology. Unlike most Greek women, Spartan women were given physical training, encouraged to build strength, and even participated in athletic contests. This was not because Sparta valued gender equality, but because they believed strong women produced strong babies. Their bodies were treated as vessels for the future army, and their personal desires were second to their reproductive function. The state expected them to nurture not just children, but the ideals of hardness, fearlessness, and loyalty. By the 7th century BC, Sparta's reproductive policies had become widely known across Greece. Other Greek states viewed Spartan women with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. Many ancient writers commented on their boldness, their athleticism, and their agency in certain aspects of marriage. Yet beneath this surface lay a rigid system in which individuals served the state's survival strategy. Marriage rituals were designed to be symbolic rather than emotional. Some traditions involved mock abduction, short haircuts for brides, and secrecy in the first years of marriage to prevent distraction from military duties. This severe lifestyle was not limited to the ruling warrior class. Even the distribution of land and inheritance was linked to producing future soldiers. Spartan families who produced sons contributed directly to the state's military strength. Those who did not were considered less valuable. Fertility and childbirth were political acts, not personal milestones. By the classical period, Sparta had become both feared and admired for its warrior production. Its armies dominated the Peloponnesian League and inspired stories that lasted thousands of years. But the foundations of that military machine were built on practices many today view as inhumane. The Spartan obsession with creating perfect warriors shaped every part of life, from infancy to marriage, from physical development to social roles. Their system raised questions about the balance between collective survival and individual humanity, questions that echo even into the present day. This was the world Sparta built, a society where love, softness, or weakness had no place, where the state controlled the future by controlling reproduction, where strength was not only expected but engineered. It was a society designed to produce warriors whose discipline and ferocity would shape Greek history, influence future empires, and leave a controversial legacy across thousands of years. By the 6th century BC, Sparta had already distinguished itself from the rest of the Greek world by forging a society where every element of life was intentionally shaped to produce warriors. But if Section 1 revealed the brutal foundations on which Sparta built its concept of perfect human stock, Section 2 takes us inside the machinery that refined that stock into hardened, disciplined, state-owned soldiers. This machinery was a combination of controlled marriages, strict social pairing, and the single most unforgiving educational system of the ancient world, the Agoge. To understand how Sparta engineered human strength, One must begin at the moment when boys, having survived the harsh infant inspection, were accepted into society. Their path was predetermined, laid down not by their families but by the state. Every part of their bodies, every moment of their time, every relationship they formed was part of a calculated design to create a warrior without hesitation, fear, or personal ambition. The Spartan elder councils decided the structure, and the boys had no choice but to step onto the path. Yet the process began before these boys even took their first breath. Marriage in Sparta was a state affair bound by laws that prioritized physical excellence. Unlike other Greek states where marriages were often arranged for political alliances or economic stability, Spartan marriages were arranged for the single purpose of producing the strongest children. Women were selected for their health and strength, often trained alongside men in athletic exercises to build endurance and muscular capability. Their fitness was not a personal pursuit, but a civic duty. The wedding ritual itself reflected Sparta's unique philosophy. The ceremony was brief and symbolic, often involving a ritual where the bride's head was shaved and she was dressed in a simple cloak and sandals. This transformation was meant to symbolize separation from girlhood and readiness for motherhood in service of the state. The groom, usually around 30 years of age, would visit his wife in secrecy, often sneaking away from his military barracks. This secrecy was not romantic in nature. It was meant to prevent emotional attachment from interfering with military discipline. The Spartans firmly believed that love or comfort could weaken a warrior's resolve. Behind this ritual lay a deeper truth. The Spartans believed that strong offspring were produced by strong pairings. If a man was unable to father children or considered physically inferior, the state allowed, and in some cases encouraged, arrangements where a physically exceptional man could father children with the man's wife. The purpose was not humiliation, but survival. Spartan elders believed that personal pride could not be allowed to sabotage the creation of strong future warriors. Thus, even reproduction was placed under the control of the state. Once a boy was born and deemed worthy of life, his personal identity was overshadowed by his identity as a soldier. In training, at age 7, he entered the Agoge, the institutionalized education system that lay at the core of Spartan strength. Here, children were divided into groups, supervised by older youths who themselves had endured the same harsh training. The program was designed to eliminate weakness, cultivate endurance, and shape boys into individuals who valued the collective over themselves. Inside the Agoge, the boys lived in barracks away from their families. This separation was deliberate. Spartans believed that children naturally formed emotional attachments to their parents that could dilute their devotion to the state. By isolating them, the elders ensured that the boys grew up seeing Sparta as their true family. Their biological parents existed only at the boundaries of life, not at its center. Training began with physical conditioning. Spartans walked barefoot, endured cold nights without blankets, and received limited food. Hunger was not considered a flaw in the system, but a crucial element. It forced the boys to learn cunning, to steal food, and to survive by their wits. However, if they were caught, they were not punished for stealing, but for getting caught. Failure reflected poorly on their discipline, not on their actions. This approach to education reveals the double nature of the Spartan system. It demanded obedience and discipline, but also encouraged initiative and courage. The boys had to learn to think, act, and fight independently, while simultaneously understanding that their individual talent existed to serve the machine of the phalanx. Their lives were a paradox of personal bravery and absolute conformity. Combat training formed the backbone of the Agoge. The boys learned wrestling, boxing, spear techniques, and a wide variety of physical drills. These were not mere sports, but simulations of battlefield scenarios. They trained to endure pain without complaint. They were taught that showing fear or crying brought shame to themselves and their group. This doctrine shaped their identity as warriors ready to stand firm, even when facing death. One cannot understand the inhumane breeding and conditioning practices without examining the culture of peer pressure in Sparta. Boys were taught to monitor each other, correct each other, and report weakness. The group, rather than the individual, became the foundation of life. This peer-driven culture reinforced state control, making the system nearly impossible to resist. The boys internalized the harsh values and passed them on to the next generation. Discipline in the Agoge was severe. The boys were routinely beaten to test their endurance. Public ceremonies sometimes involved whipping that continued until the boy fainted or died. These exercises were meant to demonstrate toughness and prepare the children for the idea that personal suffering meant nothing compared to duty. The more pain a boy endured, the more honor he received. By the time a boy reached adolescence, he had completed years of physical and psychological conditioning, but the state was not finished shaping him. At around 16, the most promising students were chosen for the Cryptire, a secretive organization that acted as a brutal proving ground. These young men were sent into the countryside, lightly armed, and commanded to survive on their own. They were instructed to move at night, hide during the day, and eliminate any threats to the state, particularly helots who appeared rebellious. This practice was both a rite of passage and a method of terror designed to keep the enslaved population in constant fear. While the Agoge shaped boys into warriors, Spartan girls were also prepared for their future roles. They trained in running, discus throwing, javelin practice, and rigorous physical exercises. Their training had one purpose: to produce strong, healthy children. Although women in Sparta wielded more social influence than their counterparts in Athens or Corinth, their power existed within the constraints of state objectives. The combined effect of all these practices was the creation of a society entirely focused on military dominance. Every aspect of Spartan life, from the home to the battlefield, reinforced the idea that the state's survival depended on its army. This ideology made Sparta one of the most formidable powers in the ancient world, feared for its discipline and admired for its military success. But it also made the society rigid, isolated, and dependent on maintaining a harsh, unnatural system of human engineering. As these boys matured into elite soldiers, they became the backbone of Sparta's military machine. Their upbringing had removed sympathy, reduced individualism, and crafted men who were physically formidable and mentally conditioned to obey without hesitation. They were the product of a society that saw human life as a resource to be molded, strengthened, and used. This system would later face challenges, especially as the Spartan population declined drastically due to its strict breeding laws. But for centuries, it created warriors whose reputation echoed throughout Greece and beyond. By the early 5th century BC, Sparta had reached the height of its power, its population engineered through centuries of strict reproductive control, and its warriors shaped by the ruthlessly disciplined Agoge. This was the era in which Sparta's inhumane breeding practices met their ultimate purpose: to forge a military force so unbreakable, so unwavering, that it dominated not only the battlefields of Greece, but also the imagination of its enemies. What had once been a regional survival strategy had evolved into a political, cultural, and military system, admired and feared across the ancient world. The effects of Sparta's human engineering model were visible in everything, from the physical appearance of its soldiers to the structure of its government. Spartan men were known for their strength, endurance, and unwavering discipline. Their shaved hair, crimson cloaks, and polished shields were symbols of a society that treated the body as a sacred weapon. Every muscle, every movement, and every instinct had been shaped through decades of training and generational planning. The state's control over reproduction had produced a smaller, more refined warrior population, but at the cost of strict social hierarchy. The Spartiates, the full warrior citizens, formed the elite class. They were the living proof of Sparta's rigid selection system. Only their descendants, born to legally approved unions between Spartan parents and raised in accordance with state laws, could become full citizens. Those who failed to meet these criteria were relegated to lower ranks such as the Perioikoi, the free non-citizens, or the Helots, the enslaved population whose labor sustained Spartan society. This rigid structure allowed Sparta to concentrate its resources on military development. Every citizen was a soldier, and every soldier represented decades of state investment. Unlike in Athens or Corinth, where citizens might be farmers, merchants, or craftsmen, the Spartiate was defined solely by his ability to fight. His entire life was a preparation for battle. Even after marriage, he lived in barracks and dined in common mess halls with other soldiers. His children, household, and personal life existed on the edges of his identity as a warrior. The effect of this system on Spartan warfare was profound. The phalanx, the primary formation used by Greek armies, required soldiers to stand shoulder to shoulder in perfect unison, their shields interlocking to form an impenetrable wall. It required discipline, trust, and absolute unity. The Spartans excelled at this because their entire upbringing had conditioned them for collective action. They were not simply fighting alongside comrades. They were fighting with men who had endured the same trials, punishments, and expectations since childhood. This cohesion created an unmatched battlefield force. When other Greek hoplites wavered or broke ranks under pressure, Spartans held firm. Their calmness during combat was legendary. Classical writers like Herodotus, Xenophon, and Thucydides described their discipline with awe. The Spartans marched into battle to the rhythm of flute music, not as a dramatic flourish but as a way to maintain step and reduce fear. Their calm, calculated movements were the consequence of lifelong conditioning. At Thermopylae in 480 BC, the world witnessed the terrifying result of Sparta's human engineering system. Although heavily outnumbered by the Persian army of Xerxes, the Spartans fought with unmatched determination. Their bravery was not simply personal courage, but the culmination of a system that punished fear, eliminated the weak, and rewarded endurance. Leonidas, the Spartan king, led 300 Spartiate soldiers, all of whom were fathers, to ensure that their bloodlines survived even if they did not. This reveals how deeply reproductive planning was woven into military policy. The state ensured that even a suicide mission would not extinguish genetic lines that had taken generations to cultivate. The battle became a defining symbol of Spartan identity, reinforcing the myth that Spartans were born different from other men. Greek poets celebrated their sacrifice, and later historians transformed the event into a legend of courage. But beneath the poetic heroism lay a stark truth. The men who died at Thermopylae were the ultimate products of a system that valued warriors above all else. However, the perfection of Sparta's military came at a cost. The strict selection and marriage laws led to a shrinking citizen population. As fewer full-blooded Spartiates were born, the pressure to preserve their elite status increased. The very system designed to create strong warriors began weakening the state from within. But this internal decline was gradual, and during the 5th century BC, Sparta remained formidable. The success of Sparta's human engineering also influenced its political structure. The Gerousia, a council of elders over the age of 60, wielded immense authority. These elders were seen not only as wise men, but also as survivors of the state's brutal system. Living to 60 in Sparta meant enduring decades of combat training, war, and hardship. Their longevity was proof of their strength, making them ideal custodians of Spartan law. Meanwhile, the dual kingship system, with 2 kings ruling simultaneously, created a balance of power and ensured no single leader could threaten the state. The state's focus on creating perfect warriors also influenced its economy. Helots cultivated the land, producing food for the warrior class. Periokoi contributed through craftsmanship, trade, and manufacturing. Spartiate men did not labor or engage in commerce. Their value came from battle. This economic model allowed Sparta to fully dedicate its elite population to military affairs. But it also made the state dependent on the labor of others, creating underlying tensions that would later erupt into crises. Inside the city, the values shaped by the breeding system dominated daily life. Young men trained constantly, hunting, running, and wrestling to maintain peak physical condition. Women supervised households and managed resources, freed from many restrictions placed on women elsewhere in Greece. Their strength and confidence reflected the state's expectation that they contribute to the next generation by being physically robust. Spartan mothers were known to tell their sons to return with their shields or on them, a phrase that emphasized duty over survival. The cultural consequences of this strict system were immense. Sparta produced no great philosophers, playwrights, or scientists, while Athens generated Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, and countless innovations. Sparta produced warriors. This was not due to a lack of intelligence among Spartans, but because their society did not value intellectual development the same way. Their identity depended almost entirely on military excellence. Yet, their influence on the ancient world was undeniable. Other Greek states admired their discipline, their courage, and their unique social order. Some even attempted to imitate aspects of the Agoge or Spartan marriage customs. The legend of the perfect Spartan warrior spread across the Mediterranean, shaping foreign policy and inspiring fear. The Spartan system also influenced diplomacy. Their reputation alone was often enough to persuade other states to form alliances or submit. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta's disciplined armies played a decisive role in the eventual defeat of Athens. Their land forces were widely regarded as superior, and their system of human breeding and conditioning contributed directly to this dominance. However, the third section of this story must also reveal how this engineered perfection began sowing the seeds of its own destruction. Even at its peak, cracks were forming. The same strict laws that produced strong warriors also reduced the population of full citizens. Wealth inequality increased as land concentrated in fewer hands. Some men died in battle without producing heirs. Others failed to meet the state's high expectations for marriage or childbearing. Yet for now, in this era of Spartan supremacy, the machinery of selection and discipline continued to operate at full strength. The Spartans believed they had achieved what no other society had, the construction of a warrior race through controlled reproduction, absolute discipline, and unwavering devotion to the state. Their model was unmatched, their military feared, and their legacy growing. But the very system that created perfect warriors also created fragility. As Sparta entered the later centuries of its existence, the consequences of its unique practices would become impossible to ignore. By the beginning of the 4th century BC, Sparta stood as both the strongest and the most fragile state in Greece. Its unmatched warriors, engineered over centuries through controlled breeding, harsh selection, and relentless military education, had secured victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, the very system that created Sparta's perfect soldiers was quietly tearing the state apart. For generations, Spartans had pursued physical perfection at the cost of population growth, social mobility, and economic stability. Now, as Greece entered a new era, the weaknesses hidden inside the Spartan machine began to rise unmistakably to the surface. The first and most damaging consequence of Sparta's breeding philosophy was demographic decline. Their strict citizenship rules allowed only those born to 2 Spartan parents, raised under state supervision, and physically fit enough to serve as hoplites to join the elite warrior class. But as centuries passed, the number of families meeting this standard dropped steadily. Each generation, fewer full, blooded Spartan children were born. The state had engineered itself into a corner. By rejecting infants deemed weak, by limiting marriage to approved unions, and by forbidding men from living fully with their wives until age 30, Sparta had drastically narrowed the flow of new citizens. By the year 371 BCE, when the Battle of Leuctra upended Spartan dominance, the number of Spartiates had fallen to a dangerously small level. Classical sources reveal that at the peak of Sparta's power, there may have been 8,000 full citizens. In contrast, by the time of Leuctra, fewer than 1,000 remained. This collapse did not happen because the men were less brave or less skilled than their fathers. It happened because the state's obsession with purity and physical strength produced a shrinking population that could no longer sustain the military structure inherited from earlier generations. Leuctra became the defining symbol of this collapse. The Theban general Epaminondas, commanding a force trained in innovative tactics, crushed the Spartan army in a single decisive battle. It was the first time Sparta's military reputation cracked. Even more damaging, large numbers of Spartan soldiers died in the battle, wiping out entire family lines. The state that had once engineered the strongest warriors in Greece now found itself unable to replace them. The deeper tragedy of this moment becomes clear when one examines how tightly Sparta had tied its identity to the idea of genetic quality. The death of each Spartan hoplite was not just the loss of a soldier. It was the loss of a carefully cultivated lineage. For centuries, the state had invested in selective reproduction, strict marriage, and harsh training. The fall of a single warrior represented the collapse of an entire generational project. Every battlefield defeat dramatically sped up Sparta's decline. Social and economic consequences followed. With fewer citizens available to inherit land and maintain estates, properties concentrated in the hands of a small number of wealthy families. This created a class of powerful elites at the top, while many others fell into poverty. Ironically, the society that preached equality among its warrior class now faced severe inequality as its population diminished. The strict laws governing marriage and inheritance, once intended to preserve purity, now prevented the recovery of Spartan numbers. Women inherited larger estates as the male population fell, leading to a concentration of wealth and further destabilizing the system. The Helot population, long kept in check through fear and oppression, began sensing Spartan weakness. These enslaved laborers had formed the backbone of the Spartan economy, farming the land and sustaining the warrior class. But as the Spartan elite shrank, controlling the Helots became increasingly difficult. Several revolts erupted, further draining the state's limited manpower. Sparta could no longer depend on terror alone to maintain order. Attempts were made to fix the crisis. Reformers like King Augeas IV and later Cleomenes III sought to redistribute land, expand citizenship, and revive the Agoge. Their plans aimed to restore the Spartan population and rebuild the military machine. Yet, these reforms were met with resistance from wealthy elites who benefited from the unequal distribution of land. Despite bold attempts, the reforms failed to reverse centuries of demographic decline. The rigid laws that had once strengthened Sparta now prevented it from adapting to new realities. The collapse of Sparta's human engineering model became most evident as new powers emerged. The rise of Macedon under Philip II and Alexander the Great reshaped the Greek world. Sparta, once the envy of Greece, found itself increasingly irrelevant. It could not field armies large enough to influence major conflicts. While Macedon conquered Persia and reshaped the Mediterranean, Sparta struggled merely to maintain local authority. Yet, even in decline, Sparta's reputation remained. Foreign kings continued to admire the discipline of its men and the structure of its society. Some attempted to imitate aspects of its military system. But imitation was impossible without accepting the extreme sacrifices Sparta had made for centuries. Other societies valued family, art, trade, and intellectual achievement alongside military strength. Sparta valued only one thing, and when that one thing faltered, the entire society buckled. One of the greatest paradoxes of Sparta's legacy is that it became more famous after its decline than during its peak. Philosophers, military historians, and political thinkers in later centuries looked back on Sparta with curiosity and admiration. Many admired its discipline and bravery, but they also questioned the cost of such a system. Sparta's inhumane breeding practices, its control over marriage, and its harsh childhood training were understood as both the source of its power and the seeds of its destruction. Modern historians and archaeologists continue to debate the exact nature of Spartan selection practices. While some classical accounts exaggerate elements such as the exposure of infants, there is no doubt that Sparta practiced a level of state control over reproduction and child raising unmatched in the ancient world. These practices shaped not only the physical strength of its warriors, but also their emotional and psychological identities. Spartan men were raised to suppress fear, resist suffering, and subordinate personal desires to the needs of the state. In the end, however, the system proved unsustainable. Human societies require flexibility to survive, and Sparta's strict reproductive and social laws left no room for adaptation. When faced with demographic collapse, economic inequality, and new military threats, the state had no tools for recovery. Its focus on physical perfection came at the expense of growth, creativity, diplomacy, and economic diversity. By the Hellenistic period, Sparta had become a shadow of its former self. It retained symbolic prestige but lacked real power. Its once feared phalanx was replaced by larger, more advanced armies. Its population continued to shrink. And although occasional leaders attempted to revive the old system, the conditions that had once supported its unique model no longer existed. Despite its failure, Sparta's legacy endures. The image of the warrior society shaped through discipline, sacrifice, and engineered strength continues to influence popular culture, military training, and historical imagination. Yet beneath the legend lies a painful truth. Sparta's greatness was built on practices that controlled human life at its most intimate stages. It shaped bodies, families, and identities with unyielding force. And ultimately, it was this very rigidity, this refusal to adapt or accept diversity, that led to its downfall. The story of Sparta's inhumane breeding practices is therefore not only a tale of ancient brutality, but also a warning. It shows how a society can achieve extraordinary discipline and strength, yet undermine itself by ignoring the basic realities of human growth. Sparta engineered warriors, but sacrificed its future. It perfected the soldier, but diminished the citizen.